Hello, everyone. This is David Seitz at Practical Catholic. Last Friday was the pro-life march down in Washington, D.C., and if you ever see those marches, they're carrying banners. And one of the banners that they carry is usually the one that says, adoption is an option. And I usually carry one of those types of banners because I'm adopted myself. But in recent times, I've joined an adoptee group, a Korean adoptee group. And in this group, there's a lot of tragedies that are written, and almost bitter people who are pretty cynical about adoption. One of them was, even wrote that he said, he implied that international adoptions were like legalized human trafficking. And then the most recent post was a young boy, a Korean boy who was adopted, who was 20 years old, had committed a suicide. So the question comes along is adoption really an option? And I can basically, we will talk about adoption through my own experience, and we will talk about what are the challenges. So today's episode is about adoption from my own experience and point of view. We will go over the good, the bad, the challenges, and successes that help those who are adopted and those parents who have adopted, all within the Practical Catholic context.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Seitz. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins back in high school. If you ever look at a picture of me, you'll notice that I'm Korean, I'm Asian, and I was adopted into a Caucasian family. So my sisters, I have two sisters and a brother. They're all by birth, so they're Caucasian. And my one sister, Patty, we were very close. We still are. But mainly just kind of facetiously, we basically try to beat up on my brother. But she's 5 years older than I am. And so she went off to college, and I was going into high school, and I played football. I played football since I was little. And so in high school, I was in the freshman team playing football. And it was the fall time frame, and my sister came home, I'm assuming, for fall break for college. And so she came to pick me up from football practice. So as football practice ends, I see my sister, Patty, who's this tall, she's about 5'10", blonde hair, a very, I have to admit, very pretty, woman, getting out of her car, walking towards me, and, just saying, hey, David, how you doing? And I'm looking at her going, hey, Patty. And, we give each other a hug, and she gives me a little kiss. And then we get in the car, and we drive home. I don't think much of it until the next day. The next day, all my friends who are on the football team seeing this interaction, say to me, who was that hot chick who picked you up? Now, excuse my language in that way, but that's what they said. And I look at them, and I said, oh, that's my sister. And they look at me, and they're like, that can't be your sister. And it quickly dawns on me that, how can it be my sister when she's this 5 foot blonde hair, white, 5'8", blonde hair, white, Caucasian woman. And I, am this 5'5" Asian boy. So I said to them, well, then she's my girlfriend. And they look at me and they go, no, she can't be your girlfriend. So I walk away saying to them, you got to choose. She's either my girlfriend or she's my sister. And so they were completely confused. And as years went on, they finally understood I was adopted. But I was adopted by a wonderful family. You couldn't ask for a better family. We used to joke around a lot. In fact, my brother used to say to other people that he was adopted into a Korean family. So when they realized we were brothers, they would always ask, oh, well, is David, that's me, is he adopted? And my brother would say, no, I am. And they would be like, oh, my goodness, this tall 6 foot Caucasian blonde hair man being adopted by a short Korean family. That's a kind of a vision that you can look at. So it was a wonderful family. So I'd like to begin by talking about my life story from beginning to end a little bit, but in a perspective of being an adopted person. And I hope these insights kind of help people who are adopted, whether you are or not, and as well as those parents who have adopted children themselves. So, in my case, being adopted is just extraordinary, but I had two other extraordinary things about myself being adopted. The first was I was adopted at the age of 5, which is, I'm not going to say it's uncommon, but it's not the most, common thing to do, okay? It is, most people want to adopt a child within the first year. And as they get older, it becomes, harder and harder to get adopted because they want younger children and not older children. So that's one that was another extraordinary thing about me. The second extraordinary thing about it is that I'm an international adoption. So not only am I, so a lot of domestic adoptions, most of the children kind of look the same, but in this case, meaning the children and the parents kind of look similar. So it almost looks like they're not even adopted, that they might be birthed. But in my case, you couldn't mistaken me for being adopted because my parents were these, tall, Caucasian, white, people. So, and I'm, Asian. So it was also a cultural difference, I came to America at age 5, speaking Korean, knowing Korean culture, to now an American culture with a different language, speaking English. And so it's pretty traumatic. Joking around, my father used to say the worst thing he ever told me was that I could have seconds. And because I would, once I did that, I would eat house and home. Because when I came to America, he said I used to just, sit in my room, and then we would say, come to dinner, and I would come to dinner, eat my one, helping of whatever food it was, wipe my mouth on the tablecloth, and then go back to my room again. And this was like, it happened every day until my father kind of said, well, you could do other things. You could play, you could do this. And there was a lot of interaction between my brothers and my brother and my sisters. And so a lot of things happened. And one of them he said was, we told you could have more. And once you did that, you just kept eating. I do eat a lot. So that's what happened. And so one of the things I always tell my kids is that ESL, English as a second language. I don't know if you ever listen to my podcast, but I will make, I will pronounce words wrong, or I might use wrong phrases or, terminology or whatever. And my kids make fun of me, and my wife does too, about that. And I always tell them, I say ESL. That's my crutch, ESL, English as a second language. And my kids always joke around and say, Dad, you've been here in America so long, you don't even know how to speak Korean. He goes, don't give us that, And I always tell them, no, ESL still, it doesn't matter. It is my second language. My primary language was Korean. So it was a very big cultural shock, in doing that. I grew up in a predominantly white environment. There, it was nothing, I would say maybe, 2 or 3 Asian people, 2 or 3 Asian families, and most of them were Filipino. So very, very, a white environment. And children are so funny, and one of the things that my parents would always ask me is, do you want to go to a Korean cultural event? And they would ask me when I was young a lot, but then as I got older, they wouldn't bother anymore. And I would always say, no, no, no. And that's because children don't want to be differentiated. Most children don't want to be differentiated. I just wanted to live the life. I wanted to be like the other kids, are. And that's what happened. So I wanted to be just like the other kids, play football, play soccer, go to school, talk to them and everything, and not be worrying about, I'm Korean and all this other stuff, which I didn't even know much about anyhow. So, it's funny. I used to be a big Steve Martin follower in the 80s. Steve Martin was this comedian, and he had this movie called The Jerk, and it's the funniest movie. In the movie, in the beginning of the movie, it opens up where Steve Martin, who's white or Caucasian, is adopted by an African American family. So he's surrounded by all these African American, people, and it's his birthday, right? And I think it's like his 28th birthday or something like that. And after he blows out the candle, his parents, who's African American, pull him aside and they go, "Son, we have to tell you something." And Steve Martin goes, "What, Dad?" And he goes, "You're adopted." And Steve Martin, which is comical because, he's surrounded by all these African Americans and he's like this only white Caucasian person there. And all of a sudden, he looks at his skin and he goes, "You mean, Dad, I'm going to stay this color?" And it's like hilarious. But, and I can laugh now, but, when I was a little kid, maybe call it the ugly duckling syndrome or whatever you call it, the butterfly syndrome. But I really thought I was going to turn white, and blonde hair and become tall. It was just a phase that I go through. And so this idea of differentiating myself and saying that I'm Korean, I did not like. And even growing up in high school and in college, people would say, "Hey, Dave, you should try to date. You should try to date, Suji or something like that, some Japanese girl." We only had about 5, maybe 7 Asian people in my school, and Suji was one of them. And they'd be like, "Oh yeah, you should go out with her because," and I was just like at it, and it was like so cringy because I was just like, "Oh man." And it's like, why can't I go out with, I don't know, Jennifer or, Betty or something like that, right? It would have to be, this Asian person. So, but in high school and in college, I actually would date Caucasian women. And I had no inkling of even being attracted to Asian women. And I don't know if that was part of my psyche or whatever it was. So I never even cared about being Korean. I just wanted to be an American going and succeeding in everything that I wanted to do, whether it be in the military, whether it be academics, whether it be sports. That's what I wanted to do. And so I'm really, put a lot of credit, and I love that my parents never forced me to do cultural events that were Korean. And they really did embrace who I was because of that. And I think that I would have been a lot worse if I had embraced the Korean culture at a young age. So, flash forward, the irony of that, I got to tell you this one story. When my first duty station when I was an officer in the Marines was Southern California. It was a base called El Toro. It's a very famous base. And if you know anything about Southern California, there's a lot of Asians there, especially there's a lot of Koreans. So one of the things that we used to do is this thing called a hail and farewell. And a hail and farewell is all the Marines that are leaving the unit, we would do a farewell speech and take them out to lunch. And any new Marines, we would come in and we would do a hail, a nice, talk about where they came from and stuff. And a lot of it was going out to lunch. So there's these. So there were about 6 of us, and we would go out to a place, and the senior sergeant who was leaving had the option of choosing where to go. So he says, "I want to go to Seoul Garden." So I was like, "Okay, that's great." And at that time, there was no iPhone or GPS. You had to find it on a map, and you had to go there. So I'm thinking it's like an African American, type of food, That's what I'm thinking. I'm not trying to say I'm prejudiced or anything like that. That was in my mind. And so I'm driving there, and I walk in the door, and all of a sudden, I see these Asian people in there. I'm like, "Oh, this is odd," right? And I sit down, and I start eating, and there's a nice restaurant. You basically get raw meat, and you cook it over this grill. And it was spicy, and it was great. And I'm looking at these, there's other 5 Marines, and I'm eating there. And I'm like, "This is awesome. This is the greatest food I've ever had in my life." And now the other 5 Marines are not Asian. They're Caucasian. I think 1 or 2 of them were Hispanic, and I'm the only Korean there. So I'm eating this food, and I asked the sergeant. I said, "Sergeant, this is the best food." I go, "What kind of food is this?" And he looks at me like I have like 6 heads coming out of my body. And he says, "Sir, this is Korean food." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you." because they're expecting me to recognize that this is Korean food. So when it was Seoul Garden, it's spelled Seoul, Seoul, as in the capital of South Korea, Seoul. So that's how much I alienated my own culture. I couldn't even recognize that this food was actually Korean food. So, and even the kimchi didn't even give it away. There was tons of kimchi all over the place. So, so that's how much I kind of alienated my own culture and how much I wanted just to integrate as being American. So now if I flash forward, I would say like 20 years later, and in my early 40s, so this would have been like around 2012, around there. Several, three things converged to make me interested in the Korean culture. The first thing that converged was I had just bought an Apple TV and trying to figure out, because I wanted to show like presentations to my kids through our even though we don't have television, we do have like this big video TV screen so that we can show like a video or something. So I got this. So I got the Apple TV so I could easily transfer it from my Apple computer over. So it came with a free subscription of kind of like a Netflix kind of a thing. So I was like, all right, let me just see what that's all about. Let me check it out. And as I'm flipping through what's there, I see this show called Road One. And it was about the Korean War. Now, I love anything that deals with the military and war. Now, not that I like war itself. That's not what I meant. I mean, I like, anything, documentaries about the Vietnam War, Korean War, I could just sit for hours. So I was like, wow, let me check this out. So I read everything about it. So it was a drama about, the Korean War. And in that, it was basically a drama. And I'm watching this and I'm mesmerized. Looking at this movie from a perspective of a Korean. They all spoke in Korean. It was subtitled and everything. And that was my first introduction to Kdrama, which now is very popular, Kdrama and K-pop and all the other stuff. So, that happened. I was like, wow, that's pretty fascinating, and I'm listening to the Korean that they're talking in and because they're speaking Korean, it's just subtitled at the bottom. So that was one convergence. The other convergence that occurred was that my daughter, who's now about 7-8 years old, is starting to question about her Korean heritage, okay? And saying like, hey, Dad, why is it that Pop, that's my father, doesn't look like you? And I would have to say, oh, because I'm adopted. I'm adopted from a place called Korea and all these things. So so that started happening. And so she's asking, well, where is your real mom? Where is your real dad? And, I had to start talking about it. It's like, what does it mean to be Korean? What is the Korean culture? She was more interested in the Korean culture than I was. And I'm kind of fumbling around going, okay. And because I'm watching a little bit of this K-drama, I kind of, explaining things and stuff. And so I started getting a little bit itchy. And I said, well, you know what? I got to learn a little bit more about my Korean culture just so I can talk to her about this. And then the third convergence that occurred was my mother was clearing out the house, and she's slowly giving me things that belongs to me, as all good parents, eventually you give it to your children. And so one of the things that she gave me was all of my adoption paperwork and all of my first clothes that I wore when I came to America. And she said, oh, David, I think you would probably want this. This is all your adoption papers. These are your, whatever. So I started reading the adoption papers, and through those three convergences, I started getting interested in the Korean culture as well as, even my, finding, possibly seeking out my birth parents. I think it's important to understand that I chose that. Okay. And I think one of the advice I would give to adopted parents is never impose. Ask the question. But I think when they're young kids, they really want to be identified as your child and be identified as part of the group of their friends. And I think a lot of times, even especially in this environment of multiculturalism and this fascination with other cultures, I think in my opinion, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that at all. And let them seek it out on their own, Okay. In fact, my oldest son is adopted from Cambodia. I have 6 children, and my oldest is adopted. The rest of them are by birth. And I never impose. I'll ask him every once in a while, but I did the same thing that my parents did to me. And he says, Dad, nope, I would just want to be known as the Cease family. I'm sure when he's about 40 or 50 years old, he'll probably want to know about his parents as well. The one thing I do want to talk about is, about Korea. This idea that one Korean that said, the adopted Korean that said that, legalized human trafficking is adoption, international adoption. I think it's a wrong statement. Korea in the 1970s, I was born in 1970, and Korea was in turmoil. The Korean War ended just 17 years. Think of it this way. The war in Iraq started in 2001. We are now in 2020. That's 19 years. Iraq is in shambles. Korea was in shambles, after the war. And at 1970s, it was almost like a Calcutta in Korea. People were dying. I've spoken to a lot of Koreans who lived in that year, older Koreans there, and they said it was horrible. Children were dying at the hundreds, possibly even thousands. They couldn't. It was so hard to remove them from the hospitals. They would just be lying there dead. And also other people. It was a very tragic situation. And, it's always hard to take children away from their biological parents, and I would never wish that upon them. But in a situation where it's poverty reigns, not only that, but add to the insult that Korea also has a very, old-fashioned. I would say a very diehard perspective on adoptions as well as single parents. And so with a combination of all those things, these children are lost. And so adoption is a way to give a child a second chance. I want to read a quote from this famous actress in Korea. Her name is Shin Ah-ri. Okay, Shin Ah-ri. And she's a fairly famous actress out in South Korea. And she said this, and I thought it's a very great quote. She said, "Adopted children are not children who were given up on. They are children who were protected till the end. Their parents protected them by giving birth. It is a matter of perspective." I love the line where it says, their parents protected them by giving birth. And this is exactly what the pro-life march is all about when they say adoption is an option. You see, one of the main reasons that I would even want to see my parents, or especially my mother, was not because I'm sentimental or anything like that. It's mainly because I would do as a parent, if I had lost my child, I know for the rest of my life I'd be wondering whatever happened to my child. It's more about saying to the parent, to my birth parents, that I'm okay. The first is saying I'm okay. I actually became a success. I came to America and I became a success, even by American standards. And the second is to say thank you. Thank you for giving me birth. Thank you for protecting me. And that's what that line is all about. Their parents protected them by giving birth. Adoption, children who are adopted are wonderful in a sense that they were protected by their birth parents and hence protected also by their adoptive parents. That is important to understand, that they were never given up, okay? They were just protected, and the best route was through that adoption. So that's my story. Now, I want to go over briefly about what are the challenges of adoption, okay? And, it's funny because I just recently joined this, I would say within like 4 months maybe, or 3 months, this, Korean adoptee group. And it's, in some ways, it's very, very cynical. I'm always like, wow, that's cynical, but I do see the challenges, and I see the challenges that I had to face as well. So if you're adopted or if you are parents of adopted children, let me go over a couple of these so that you kind of understand, okay? The first is a sense of belonging. If you look at most of those adoptees who are in crisis, they have no sense of belonging. And that is so, so true. There is no sense of belonging originally. I'll give you the story. It's so funny. It's a pretty funny story in which when I was in the military, most of the haircut places were run by Korean people. I don't know why, but in the military, they, when you went to the barbershop, all of them were Korean ladies. And I always liked getting my hair cut. I would get one every 2 weeks, and it was the same rituals. They would, I'd get my high and tight, it's very short, and then they would give you a massage. But the ritual would always happen this way. I would go there, and these ladies would start talking to me in Korean, 안녕하세요, and all this other stuff, and they would talk to me. And eventually I would say to them, I don't know how to speak Korean. And they wouldn't talk to me, ever. Again, and they also spoke English, because when other Marines were getting their haircuts, they would talk to them. Oh, hi there, Sergeant so-and-so, how's the... So I knew they spoke English, but they wouldn't talk to me. So finally, I had a friend of mine, he was a captain, and I was a captain, and I told him, I said, every time I go to the barbershop, these Korean ladies talk to me in Korean, and once they talk to me in Korean, and they realize I don't speak Korean, they don't, they stop talking to me. And my friend started he's African-American, and he started laughing at me, and he goes, that's not true. And I said, it is. So we went, and we got our haircuts together, and as sure as anything, this, short, Korean lady comes up, she starts talking to me in Korean, and then I tell her, I'm sorry, but I don't speak Korean, and then they stop talking to me. And now, in the meantime, my friend who's African-American, the barber, she's cutting his hair, and she started talking to him and everything. So my friend goes, why is it that you're not talking to my Korean friend that's over here once he doesn't speak Korean? Once he says he can't speak it. And the lady says to my friend, he goes, oh, that's because he's not really Korean. I was like, my friend starts laughing hysterically, right? I started laughing a little as well. And he goes, so my friend goes, but he is. I mean, he has all the features and, and everything else. And he goes, but she goes, no, he's not real Korean. He's not real Korean. And I'm like, okay. So you find out that you are not culturally Korean, but you look Korean. So where is the sense of belonging? In a sense that you don't belong to the Caucasian family because you're not Caucasian. So they don't fully accept you in some ways, but then you're not fully accepted in the Korean culture because you're not culturally Korean. You don't speak the language. You don't behave like they do. So it's really, it's the sense of belonging. So in my case, I looked physically different, and there's this idea that you don't belong, and so a lot of times you can fall under two modes. One is a chip off the, like a chip on your shoulder kind of a thing, or the other is you just start going inside of yourself, right? And there's a lot of things that remind you that you are different. Okay, you look at a family picture, and you're the only one that's Asian in that whole family picture. You can spot yourself really quickly. It's really amazing. People remind you. That I don't know how many times I'll rent a vehicle or go to a hotel, and they'll say, "What's your last name?" And I'll say, "Cease." They'll say, "Spell it, S-U-E-S-S," and they'll say, "That doesn't sound like it's Asian." And I'm like, no, it's not Asian. It's actually German, and I'm adopted, right? So, even small statements like chip off the old block, okay? Well, I can't be a chip off of the old block of my father because I'm not his biological, son, but so there's this, it's hard to get a sense of belonging, and a sense of fitting in. And that's what happens. It's funny. what I've come to the conclusion is, on this sense of belonging, is the idea that I'm an American, you know? And in this Korean adoptee, this adoptee group, they tend to, and I've seen this even in minority groups. They say, "Oh, that's a white man thing," or that's a white man. White people do this. White people say that, right? And I kind of laugh. And a couple of the Koreans actually said, "Well, I actually say that," maybe. And even some of these Koreans will say, "Well, I didn't realize how white I really was until I realized that white people say these things." And I was like, well, no, it's not a white man thing. It's an American thing, okay? It's the culture of the American. My father, who's 100% German, and he's like a third, or I think he's actually fourth or fifth generation German, doesn't speak German, doesn't culturally behave German, okay? He visited Germany where his family roots go into, which is near the Black Forest. And, you would think that he looks like the average German that's there. But he's not. And he knows that he's not culturally German. He doesn't speak the language. He's culturally American. Okay? I have another friend of mine who is Chinese. And he's not adopted. He's born and raised. But he's, I think, third or fourth generation Chinese. And he speaks English. He doesn't know how to speak Chinese. He behaves, in a Caucasian world. I mean, in an American cultural way. So the stereotyping of saying just because this cultural behavior that we have, yes, it was predominantly created by white people or Caucasian people. It's really American. That's what American culture is all about. Okay, and I can tell you that this culture is different in different parts of the country. Being in America, as well as having my own business, I've traveled this nation pretty far and wide, and every culture, even within the United States, is different. It's very different. The culture down south, slower, more traditional. Up here north, it's faster. Maybe a little bit more sarcastic. But that's the culture and we live in. That's the American culture. When we adopted our first child, actually our only child, which is my oldest, we had to get a home study, and we used Catholic services. And one of the ladies there said, so when you adopt this child from Cambodia, are you gonna what kind of culture are you gonna bring them up in? And my wife and I were like, I was kind of a little shocked, and I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, it's recommended that you send this Cambodian child to the Cambodian Cultural Center, and so that he can identify as being Cambodian. And we kind of said, oh, okay. And that night we actually went home, and my wife and I had a big discussion on what culture are we going to bring our children up. And we decided that the culture in which we develop, the first being devoutly Catholic, and the second being a combination of the traditions that her parents brought up, the traditions that I brought up, and whatever things that we also wanted to bring up. In America, we can develop our own culture. There's no, we don't have to label it white, black, Caucasian, Asian, whatever it is. Because at the end of the day, after a couple of generations, whatever heritage you came from, it's going to be lost, or it's going to be morphed into something really strange. And you're seeing that. You can talk to any Indian who comes here from, India, and they're the third generation Indian, third person to be, they have no idea what India is all about. Just like if you got a third generation German or a third generation Polish person, they're never going to know what their, cultural heritage was back in Europe, because they became American. They created their own culture here in America. That's the beauty of America. So this idea that we need to have these roots is foolish. It really is. So the real sense of belonging is your own. Create your own. Create your own culture. All right? And absorb the culture that's around you, because it is good. I'd like to read one of a good Bible story to read about, in basically kind of absorbing a culture, is the Book of Ruth. Now, if you know anything about the Book of Ruth, Ruth was, she's in the line of Jesus. She's in the line of David. Okay, and actually the genealogy of Matthew will say that. Okay, the genealogy of Matthew will pick out that Ruth is part of Jesus' genealogy. Why? Because Ruth is non-Jewish. She's actually, what is she? She's a Moabite. So she's not even Jewish. So there are aspects of Jesus' line or King David's line that are not fully Jewish. Okay? All right? So Ruth would marry Boaz. And the child of Ruth and Boaz is Jesse, where we get the word Jesse tree from. Okay? And that is, Jesse is the line of King David. So this is a quote from Ruth. So what happens is Ruth married one of Naomi's son. And Naomi was a Jewish woman, and she went to the land of the Moabites, and her two sons married two Moabite sisters. Ruth follows Naomi back to the land, of her origin, which is the Jewish origin. And then Ruth eventually would marry Boaz, who's Jewish, right? They would fall in love and they would get married, and then their child would be Jesse. But this is what Ruth says, okay? So Naomi now is destitute. Her husband died and her two sons died, and now she basically says, I'm going to go back to my land, the Jewish land. And, and Naomi says to Ruth and to her sister, go back, stay here in the Moabites. Don't come with me. Just stay. And so Ruth's sister stays in the land of the Moabites. But Ruth says, I want to go with you. I want to die where you die. I'm going to, your people will be my people. In other words, your culture will be my culture. Okay? And listen to this. It says, but Ruth said, this is from Book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16 to 18. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if even death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Ruth embraced the culture. Now, Ruth got a rich blessing for doing that, because she is now in the line of David, forever memorialized. Her actions saved her, because she is now in the promise, the promise of the Jewish people. That's what she did, and she embraced. I love it when she says, your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. When we embrace the culture of the land that we go to, that's what we do. And so that's, important to understand how we can combat the sense of belonging. And what's beautiful about the American culture is that it is a melting pot. It really, really is. I love America. I've been to other countries. I've been to Africa. I've been to Europe. I've been to Asia as well. And I find that a lot of those cultures are very myopic. They're African, Italian, European, or whatever they are. But I love being in America because I can go down the street. I'm going to have Italian food today. No, I'm kind of Chinese food. No, I'm going to have, Jewish food. No, you know what? I'm going to have, Indian food. No, the variety and the cultures and the people that are here are so wonderful. That's the sense of belonging. That's the sense that you have. Okay? And that's the beauty of America. This wide range of cultural aspects, but all being melted together. And eventually, it doesn't matter if you're white, black, if you're Caucasian or African or Hispanic or whatever it is. We're all Americans, and that is what's important. So the sense of belonging, and, that's something that we all struggle with as a sense of belonging, whether you're adopted or biological. You know, we all want to fit in as an American, fit in that culture that is there, just like Ruth did. The second challenge, the identity crisis. Who am I? Okay. That was very, very hard. You know, it was hard for me to identify who I was. As I said, that movie like The Jerk by Steve Martin, where he thought he was going to turn, black. And with me, I thought I was going to turn white because I, was in a Caucasian family. And then when I was bullied, when I was in, sixth grade. And, I had to deep look at myself and say, who am I? Okay? Who am I? And I realized when I was bullied that I am a good person. I'm a person that's loved by my parents and my sisters and brother. Yeah, we had our fights and everything else, but I am a good person. And that's what every person is. We're all good because we all reflect the image and likeness of God. We all are loved by God, and we are all destined for God. And so the identity crisis of who am I, it doesn't matter if you're white, you're black, or brown or yellow, whatever it is, okay? It's that you are a wonderful person that reflects the image and likeness of God. And it's only our sins that destroy who we are. So I did go through identity crisis, but I think all young kids go through identity crisis, regardless of whether you're adopted or not. The challenge that adopted children, especially international children, is that they have the added baggage, I should say, that they look different than their parents. Okay? And that's okay. Because what matters the most is that they love you. And and you turn that love back. So identify who you are. You're a child of God. You're a wonderful person. And every person who's out there are that. So, yes, do we have to figure out, what kind of, job we're going to have and what kind of profession? Am I called to a religious life? Am I going to be a priest? All these things, yes, we have to figure out what our vocation is, and that's what we need to focus on, But knowing that you're a child of God is the most wonderful thing that you can think of. That transcends any culture, transcends any color, transcends any culture that's out there. That's why in the Catholic Church it is called Catholic, universal. Because as a child of God, you are universally accepted, universally loved. You are that person. And all you have to do now is figure out what your vocation is. Is it the marriage? If it is, then how do I support? If you're a male, how do you support your family? If you're a woman, how do I, bear children or take care of them? Am I going to homeschool or not? And collectively together, raising a good Catholic family. Or am I called to the religious life? Or am I called to the priesthood? So those are the things that we need to focus on. But when we are constantly saying, who am I? Even at age 50, that's pretty bad. That's an answer that should be answered back when you were 10 or, at the most, 12 or 13 years old. Who am I? I'm a child of God. Another challenge is an adjustment to a new culture. Okay. As I said before, we are, I had to adjust to a new culture. I was, a Korean culture, and it took a while, it really, really took a while. It was funny, as I said, recently I started understanding Korean a little bit and studying it, the language. And I finally realized that when you say their name, you sometimes end it with a. So you might say David okay? And I remember growing up and my brother always saying to me, David, why do you have to always end it with a? And I was like, and I didn't understand why he kept saying that. It was just a natural habit that I must have ended everything with a, because that's part of the Korean language. And it didn't dawn on me until recently when I started studying the Korean language that there are certain times where you say at the end of a name. And I was like, oh, so that's probably where I got that from. So an adjustment to a new culture, especially in my case, in doing that. So the other, and this is really, really important, and I've seen this, is hypersensitivity. Okay? The challenge is hypersensitivity. And I think all children go through hypersensitivity because, again, they all want to belong. But here's the added thing that adopted kids have. It's a hypersensitivity towards comparing yourself with your siblings in a sense of, belonging. And I'll give you an example, okay? And again, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but one of the things that all my siblings had, except for me, was silver bells. Silver bells. So what is it? It was bells made in silver, and it had their name engraved on it. And when we would, put up the Christmas tree, every single one of my siblings had a silver bell, except for me. And I remember one time, a long time ago, my father said, "Oh, one day I'm going to get you the silver bell." No, he never did, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that he was a bad father, okay? And it doesn't bother me. I'm not scarred for life. But I do remember when I was little, it did bother me a little bit. It's like, why is it everyone has silver bells except for me? And I was like, is it because I'm adopted? Is it because of this? Or, all this stuff. I'm just using this as an example, okay? That's that hypersensitivity. So as an adopted child, they have a hypersensitivity to this extra belonging in a way that is like, okay, so I know that, my brother's name is Bobby. Bobby has this, and Linda has this, and Patty has this, but I don't have this. What's that, right? So you kind of feel as though, like, am I being singled out in this family because I am adopted? So that hypersensitivity. Now, it is not, a lot of things. The thing that you have to be careful about with that is that you can always slant hypersensitivity bad or good. I could have easily had blown out of proportion. I never got silver bells and went ballistic and crazy and everything else. But I didn't, okay? Because reasonably speaking, okay, my father probably got these silver bells in one shot, and then he just constantly forgot. Like I forget a lot of times in doing things. So it's not as though, they're doing something mean or whatever, but it's our hypersensitivity towards am I being singled out? Okay. I'm going to tell you a short story. One time, when I was at Villanova University, I went to a minority, I had to go to a minority class or this thing. And I had to go with my parents. And so all the minorities of Villanova were there. And this woman who's up there starts screaming about how, white, that Villanova is 90% white, and most of them are racist and blah, 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 and all everything. And at that point, I was in the Marines. I worked with Caucasians. I worked with African Americans. I worked with Hispanics. I mean, you name it, I worked with them. In really, bad circumstances sometimes. So to hear this, it was really, really kind of whatever. It was kind of harsh. And so she's just saying all these things, and he goes, if you have a white person that's next to you, you don't know if they're racist or not. So I left this meeting being very, very hypersensitive to racism, extremely, to the point where if a white person looked at me very oddly, I would immediately assume that the guy was racist, right? Even though he could be looking at me oddly because my hair is all messed up, or because I have food in my, on my nose or something like that, right? That's what happened. So after 6 months of suspecting that every white person was racist, and for me to be on edge because I was thinking everyone was after me, it came to a big climax where I remember going to a 7-Eleven at my house, and I used to always go to the 7-Eleven. It was one of my favorite 7-Elevens. And I saw this kid. He was probably 18 years old. And, I gave him, my stuff that I wanted. And he looks at me oddly, and he's just like processing them. And I remember this like deep kind of like anger coming over me because he just wouldn't look at me, and he had this like disgusted look. And I remember getting angry and going, "You must be a racist. You must be that racist white man." And I walked out the door, and I'm going, why am I assuming that guy's racist? Why am I doing that? And why am I getting angry about that? And then I just said to myself, you know what? From now on, I'm going to assume no one is racist until I have diehard proof the guy calls me some racist thing in front of me, And even that, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. And once I did that, I was at peace, and I had so much fun, and I just didn't care. That's what happened, right? So this hypersensitivity can cause us to exaggerate these behaviors of others that make it worse than what it really is, or even think that it is worse than what it really is. So hypersensitivity, you got to be careful about that. Bottom line, at the end of the day, and if you look at a lot of these things, they're all narcissistic behaviors. They're thinking about themselves. And I'm not saying that they're bad or evil or whatever, but I find that the more you think about yourself, the more you can find problems out there. This is why meditation and meditating on Christ, Our Lady, on everything, draws us out of ourselves. We think about God rather than ourselves. Because sooner or later, we're going to make ourselves a God if we keep being narcissistic and think about ourselves. But if we transcend and meditate on Christ, His sufferings, His abilities, and our call to serve others, you'll be at a lot more peace. You'll be at a lot more peace because you will no longer be narcissistic. At the end of the day, we are all adopted. We are. I want to read you Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. This is St. Paul. But when the time had fully come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So through God, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir. That is beautiful. So in essence, we are all adopted. We are adopted into the family of God. We were adopted when Christ brought us home. And this beauty of adoption, I can fully understand better than anyone else because I am adopted. And I know truly what it means to say Abba, Father, to a really wonderful father, like my father, who brought me into this family, and the family bringing me in, and treating me no different. That's what Christ does. That's what God the Father does. So in reality, we are all adopted. And I'd like to say the one thing, even if our parents, I want to read you Psalm 27, verse 9 through 10. And it says, Thy face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not thy face from me. Turn not thy servant away in anger. Thou who hast been my help. Cast me not off, forsake me not. O God of my salvation, for my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me up. So even if our fathers and mothers do forsake us, the Lord will never do that. Because we are in this great family of God, in this great family where God wants us to learn about Him and love Him. So in conclusion, I can say is embrace the culture that we live in, which is an American culture. Love who you are. And we're all destined to see God, and we're all adopted eventually. So let's end it with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, all children are special. You had said one day that Let the children in, for it is those that will enter the kingdom. Whether they're adopted or not, let them realize the innocence of being a child. Let us firmly affirm life. Life, the women who choose life and give up their child so they may have life. I pray for all those women. I pray that you console them. I pray that you tell them that they are wonderful for protecting that child for 9 months and willing to take the courage to give that child a new life with someone else. As we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Cease, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect. Do I appreciate my culture and my life that God has given me? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom